Hi, my name is James Holland-Jones, and I'm a professor of environmental social sciences at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. Today, I'm going to talk about causal analysis in anthropology. Incorporating the tools of causal analysis will help make your research more rigorous. Perhaps as important in this time of social, political, and environmental crisis, understanding causality allows us to see how our work and the work of other scientists can be misused for nefarious political purposes. We've probably all heard the bon mot, correlation does not imply causation. It's easy enough to make this point by pointing out some obviously spurious correlations, which can always be hilarious. Consider, for example, the very strong linear relationship between cheese consumption and the number of deaths from becoming entangled in bed sheets. It's pretty obvious that this is not, in fact, a causal relationship, and that the strong correlation arises randomly, or less likely through the mutual causation of some unmeasured set of covariates. The problem is, as anthropologists, and social scientists more generally, we mostly observe correlations. This fact has never stopped many social scientists, and frankly most journalists, from jumping on the causation bandwagon, though. Making causal statements from correlational data without carefully considering the causal structure of the problem can lead to some pretty bad outcomes. A big problem with giving non-causal correlations causal interpretations is that ideology and other biases can creep in. A spectacular example of this comes from 1967, when a RAND economist named Edward Mitchell provided recommendations for how to improve government control in the context of the escalating conflict in Vietnam. In a 1967 paper in Asian Survey, he wrote, "The ideal province from the point of view of government control is one in which population density is high, cross-country mobility is low, few peasants operate their own land, and distribution of farms by size is unequal. Large estates, formerly French-owned and now primarily government of Vietnam run, exist, and no land redistribution has taken place." Note that in 1967, 42% of South Vietnamese were landless peasants. While there was attempted land reform in 1956, the process was hijacked by local landlords. Consequently, very little was actually redistributed. At the same time, the insurgent Viet Cong enacted land reform in the areas under their control. As a result, they attracted thousands of recruits. So Mitchell, who had never been to Vietnam, got it perfectly backwards. Regions had higher land equality because they had been controlled by the VC. In contrast, areas controlled by the government of South Vietnam were characterized by the stark inequality of the colonial era because the government didn't enact land reform. So here we see the correlation that Mitchell produced. The good news is we now have tools for doing better. We are inundated with spurious and confounded correlations every day from both the news media and marketers. Consider nearly every health story out there. Are hot baths protective, as Harvard Health suggested? Or are people with the luxury of bathtubs and the time to take baths more likely to eat better diets, have better health care, live in less stressful neighborhoods? As I've noted, spurious correlations can make for some great comedy, but they can really be a disaster for science, as I think we've already gotten a sense for. The great news is that when you do field work in the same place over a long period of time, it's relatively easy to do longitudinal research, almost by definition. And longitudinal research lends itself to causal analysis. Anthropological fieldwork lends itself to longitudinal research. Longitudinal research has numerous strengths. It allows researchers to document detail over the life course. It provides temporal order, which is essential for causality. It allows us to understand dynamics of behavior and development. It allows us to link early exposures to later outcomes. And it provides insight into mechanisms. For the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk about causal graphs and how they are great tools for thinking, for inferring causality, and just generally for helping us with our science. Causal graphs are a tool for assessing causal relationships in your data. Most importantly, though, they're tools for thinking. There are a lot of technical details associated with doing formal causal analysis that I really don't have time to address in this very short video. I hope to provide a feel, though, for what the analysis looks like and what follows. A graph is defined by a set of vertices and edges. Sometimes you call the vertices nodes. A causal graph is very much like a network, except the vertices represent variables rather than people, and the directed edges represent causal relationships. So I've drawn a network here. A graph, a causal graph, is directed, okay? These are graphs in the graph theoretic sense. That is, collections of vertices and edges, as I've mentioned. The edges happen to be directed. A vertex A is said to cause vertex B if there's a directed edge from A to B, right? So we go from cause to effect. Technically, causal graphs are known as directed acyclic graphs, or DAGs, right? Those are the vertices, the cause, and the effect. They're directed, as we've already noted, causes point to effects, and they're acyclic, meaning that there are no cycles of causation. DAGs encode causal assumptions. Causal relations are directional. Causal relations are acyclic. A variable cannot cause itself either directly or indirectly. The absence of an arrow between x and y makes a strong causal statement by itself. It means that you are certain that x and y are independent of each other. A concept that we need to use causal graphs is a path. Here's a directed causal graph. It's pretty complicated. The outcome is the center magenta vertex. And then highlighted in red is one direct path emanating from the other magenta vertex. So that's a single path. What we want for causal analysis are directed paths. We want all the arrows to be pointing in the same direction, from cause to effect. Here's a three-path. I'm sorry, this is a two-path. Here's a three-path. Here's a five-path. And here, highlighted in green, is what we call a semi-path. From a causal standpoint, we only care about the directed paths. However, we have to worry about the semi-paths. A semi-path is a path on a directed graph that's not directed, right? The variables can go in the wrong direction, or the causes can go in the wrong direction. Variables connected by a semi-path will be correlated, but the correlation does not represent a causal effect. And our goal in doing causal analysis is to eliminate these non-causal paths. By the way, there are 32 of these, so we have a lot of work to do with this particular analysis. All right, so a recipe for causal analysis. It's pretty straightforward. We list all the paths connecting causes with your outcome. We classify the paths as open or closed. That is, do they have colliders on them? We'll talk about colliders in a second. Identify each backdoor path, that is, paths with arrows that move toward the causes. And if there are backdoor paths, we choose variables to condition on, in other words, to control for, to close them. And we hope that that's possible because it's not actually always possible. In short, we find the paths and we close the backdoors. That's really all causal analysis is. So let's step through an ethnographic example based on the fieldwork of my former postdoc, Lucy Clutch. Lucy was interested in understanding rural-urban migration in Ethiopia. We can use a free online tool called Dagity to draw and analyze our causal graphs. Here I've rendered a graph where the outcome variable of interest is migration. Lucy had a specific hypothesis that birth order had a causal effect on the likelihood of migration. The variables included in her analysis were present land holdings, future land holdings through inheritance relationships, sibship size, age, social network composition, economic opportunities, both in the natal village and in urban areas, climate, meaning historical temperature and rainfall, and birth order. Now, it's a complicated causal graph, but if we look closely, there are three structures that make up this graph. The first are called pipes, okay? And a pipe is a path that connects three or more variables, x to y to z. You can see a pipe, there are multiple of them, but you can see one highlighted here, age to social networks to economic opportunities. A second structure that makes up a complicated causal graph is called a fork. A fork is the classic confound. Z jointly causes both x and y and introduces a spurious correlation between them. You can see a fork here highlighted in the causal graph of Lucy's Ethiopia research, in that age has a causal effect both on the SIBSHIP size and on birth order. Perhaps the most exotic, and the one that I've already referred to because it's so important for closing backdoor paths, is a collider. The key point about colliders is that they close paths, as I've already mentioned. In other words, you don't have to control for anything upstream of a collider. You can see a collider here in the example highlighted here, in that social networks and climate both determine economic opportunities. Really important. This is super important. The flip side of this is that when you condition on a collider, in other words, when you include it as a variable in your regression model or whatever you're doing, you open that path back up again, potentially introducing non-causal effects. Maddeningly, you can also open up a path by conditioning on a descendant of a collider, meaning something that isn't directly on the path but is related to that collider. DAGITY and software like it will help you analyze your causal graphs and find all of these possible relationships. Thinking in terms of colliders and the fact that they close paths makes us reconsider our traditional strategies for throwing everything into the regression in an effort to control for things. Here we have a long path, it's actually a semi-path, that goes from x all the way over to y. There's a collider in the middle. S and U mutually cause t. And what that means is that x and r are actually independent of v and y. The second we control for anything in that collider, if we control for t, for example, then what happens is we open up a non-causal path between x and r and our variable of interest y. Okay? So this is the reconsideration of our approaches to this. When we throw everything in there and we run the possibility of including a collider, this is sometimes called a kitchen sink regression, or what Westreich and Greenland called a table 2 problem, from the table in an epidemiology paper that conventionally contains the results of various regression models. The anthropologist Richard McElreath has colorfully called such models causal salad. We should avoid causal salad at all costs. In the brief time I have left, I want to provide just a couple more examples of anthropological interest. I'll focus on colliders because I think that's the concept arising from causal graphs that most researchers have the least intuition about. All right, so consider the question of whether grandparents have a causal impact on a child's outcome. For example, educational attainment, stature, well-being, something like that. And this is an impact that's independent of the child's parents. From the causal graph that I've drawn here, we see that there's a pipe connecting grandparent status to child status through the parents. It seems obvious that we just condition on the parent status to find the direct causal effect of grandparental status on child status, right? Unfortunately, as Breen showed in 2018, there's certainly some unmeasured variables here that jointly cause the outcomes of parents and children. For example, shared household or neighborhood characteristics, the effects of a spouse or another parent or other kin. Our natural inclination to control for parental status actually induces a potentially quite strong non-causal effect. We need another statistical strategy if we want to identify grandparental effects. And note also that there's another unmeasured set of covariates that connect grandparents and parents. Parents in this sense are kind of a super collider. So we really need a better model and a better research design for identifying and isolating grandparental status and its impact on children's outcome. Okay, finally, let's look at a classic social network question. When we see a behavior or a custom that clusters in a social network, it's natural to ask the question, is this the result of diffusion or contagion, Or is it homophily, meaning that people who are likely to share the behavior are more likely to form social ties? Christakis and Fowler used relational data, that is, data on existing friendship ties. In statistical parlance, they conditioned on the existence of a tie. When we draw the more complete DAG, that almost certainly includes unmeasured factors that make the friendship between I and J more likely and increase their risk of obesity. All right, so that's the UI and UJ here. What do we do? And when we indicate conditioning, we'll draw a box around a variable in a DAG. So we've included I and J, UI and UJ, these unmeasured variables that could be really important that have to do with genetics and shared social environments, right? What do? We induce, you guessed it, it's a collider. Conditioning on this friendship opens up a backdoor path between the obesity status of I and J. And there it is. The statistician Cosma Shalizi, among others, has noted that homophily and contagion are generically confounded in observational social network studies. If we want to distinguish between the two, we need to use different approaches to gathering data. The good news is, I believe that anthropological fieldwork lends itself to such approaches. The bad news is that I don't have time to talk about it here, so maybe next time. Things are changing fast. We can do much better. I actually think that anthropologists, by the very nature of our research, are in a stronger position than many social scientists to do rigorous causal research. Anthropological research fieldwork lends itself to longitudinal designs. There are vastly improved opportunities for learning causal methods, and just as importantly, a number of anthropologists training people in causal methods now. Open science has come to anthropology and is making it more rigorous on a daily basis. Upcoming students are frequently more comfortable with these approaches than their elders. The kids really are all right. Second, there's a whole slate of quantitatively sophisticated anthropologists who are starting to publish research with methods that incorporate causal reasoning. For example, there's currently a special issue of the open access journal Evolutionary Human Sciences, with which I'm involved, on causal methods in evolutionary anthropology. There are also a great many new books, fantastic books, and associated lectures and videos. One of the best books is written by Richard McElreath, who heads the Department of Human Behavior, Ecology, and Culture at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology in Leipzig. His lecture material that accompanies the book is freely available and on the internet. So I hope that this brief lecture has given you a sense for the power of causal thinking for improving our science. There's some technical bits for sure, but the tools are actually quite accessible, and I think they're pretty intuitive as well. And the help resources are increasingly abundant. I wish you the best of luck with your future research, and hit me up if you have any questions. Thank you.